The termagant was old, so old that he could not remember a time when he had been young. He could dimly remember when there had been other termagants, but he'd been strong then and driven them out. Later on, there had been people who worshipped him and built a temple for him to live in, thinking that he was some kind of god. They worshipped him because he was so destructive, which is what often happens, but that sort of religion never works out in the long term. After he had turned many of them into statues, the ones that were left fled and left him in his temple. He had no company now. Even the wild creatures kept away from the temple. In vain did he wander abroad and call out to his people in the south. There was no answer. He probably was the last termagant in the carpet. Sometimes he went to find some company. Anything would do. Just some other living thing. He wouldn't even eat them, but it never worked. He only had to get near, and they'd get stiff and cold and unfriendly for some reason. So he tramped back to his ruined temple, his tail dragging behind him. He was almost at the door before he smelled the smell, and forgotten smell of company. Snibble had reached the ruined temple just before. He felt Roland's hooves trot over hard wooden pavings. Around him, lit by a faint glow, he could see fallen walls, littered with statues. Some were holding out boxes and bowing low. Some were crouched back, hands to their eyes. There were small wild animals there too, unmoving. In the center of the temple, there was a ruined altar, and that was the source of the glow. On it and around it were piled treasures. There were stones of salt and black jet, boxes of clear varnish and red wood, carved bone rings, crowns of bronze, all heaped anyhow. By the treasure was another statue. It was a small warrior, hardly half Snibble's height. Magnificent mustaches hung down almost to his waist. In one hand, he held a sword and a round shield. In the other, a necklace of glittering salt crystals. His face was turned up in an expression of surprise. A fluff creeper had crept across the floor to him, giving him a necklace of living red flowers. Snibble tethered Roland to the pillar and shuddered. Someone else had tethered their mount there before Snibble. It stood there, still. It looked like a pony, but it was no larger than a mud-wrung dog, and it had 6 legs. Snibble could have picked it up in both hands. There it stood, wearing a thin coat of dust. Puzzled, Roland lowered his head and sniffed at the still muzzle. Snibble paddled over to the mound of treasure and stared in awe. There were even coins there, not Terrani, but large wooden discs bearing strange signs. There were heavy swords and chests of carved grit, set with salt gems. He stood and stared and saw the warrior out of the corner of his eyes. Hand reaching out, that was why the warrior had come, and the termagant had found him. There was a jingling noise. Snibble saw a reflection in the statue's polished shield. It showed something scaly and nearly shapeless. It was in the doorway, Snibble thought, right behind me. But if I turn around, he unhooked the shield, holding it up so that he could see over his shoulder. The termagant jingled. Around its leathery neck were chains of varnish and redwood. Every claw was a glitter. and with rings. Bracelets were threaded on the scaly tail. Every time it moved its big beaked head, it sent a little tinkling noise echoing around the temple. It peered at the altar and sniffed. Even in the shield, the eyes frightened Snebrel, but they were large and misty blue, not frightening at all. Eyes you could get lost in, and he thought, and turned to stone. Roland gave a whiny, but it ended in midair, when there was another statue in the cold hall. Snebrel's senses screamed at him to turn around and face the creature, but he stood still and thought desperately. The termagant began to jingle towards him. Snebrel turned, holding the polished shield before his eyes. Under it, he could see the termagant's feet scraping towards him. They were bony and clawed, and they didn't stop. It ought to have turned to stone if it saw itself. So much for bright ideas, he thought, and it was the only one he had. He started to back away, and then the termagant didn't stop, for it had seen another termagant. There, in the shield, a scaly green face looked back at it. A necklace hung over one ear. For a moment the creature had found company. Then, because he was shaking with fear, Snebrel tilted the shield. The face vanished. After a moment of shocked silence, the termagant let out a howl of anguish and echoed around the hairs. A massive foot stomped. Then the creature collapsed on the floor, put its paws over its eyes, and began to sob. Every now and then, it drummed its feet back on the floor. The sobs started at the tail end by the look of it, and got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger as they gulped their way towards the mouth. It wasn't only terrifying, it was also embarrassing. Nothing should have had as many tears as it had. Snebrel watched the pool of tears spread out over the floor and touched the statue of the hair hog by the wall. It twitched its nose. Wider and wider went the pool. Some statues awoke as it touched them, but some of the oldest, all covered in dust and creepers, stood unchanged. Little creatures swam vigilantly to freedom between their ankles. Snebrel scooped up some tears in the shield and splashed them over Roland. When it was the turn of the little pony, which stared up at Snebrel in amazement, he ran to the warrior by the treasure and drenched him. Nothing happened for a moment. Then an eyelid flickered. The hand with the necklace started to move. The little warrior was suddenly very much alive. He dropped the necklace and glowered at Snebrel. "Cone's bones! Where did you spring from?" Then he saw the termagant in the pool of tears. His hand went to his throat and found the creeper. He looked thoughtfully at Snebrel. "How long have I been here, stranger?" "I don't know. This is the 3rd year after the second counting in the reign of the Emperor Tarragon. At where?" said Snebrel. "You're Doomy?" said the really statue, unwinding the creeper. Sort of." "I'm not," said the little warrior proudly. "We don't count, but I've heard of Targon before. I came here. It was the 22nd year of his rule. When you must have been here a year," said Snebrel. "A year? A year away," said the warrior. "Far too long." He bowed solemnly. "1,000 pardons, stranger," he said. "You shall be rewarded for this. I, Brocando of Brock, Lord of Jeopard, king of the deaf mines. Promise you that. Yes, rewarded. I didn't do it for a reward, said Snebrel. I just wanted the thing to stop turning everything into statues. It didn't do it. Or what brings you this far from home then? Brocando said, with a glint in his eye. The treasure? Eh? No, look, do you think we better go? Said Snebrel, glancing at the termagant again. It might get up. Brocando flourished his sword. 1 year of my life, he shouted. I'll make it pay for that. Snebrel looked at the creature again. It was lying quite still. I don't think there's much more you can do to it, he said. It looks miserable enough to me. Brocando hesitated. You might be right, he said. There is no revenge on a witless beast. As for this, he swept his arm over the shimmering heap. I have lost the taste for it. Let it lie here, he sniffed. It is on my mind that such things as these are fit only for termagants. Mind you, that necklace looks rather... No. Snebrel had seen 1 or 2 items that he rather liked. And by the look of him, Brocando could leave the treasure behind because he had lots more at home. Because he felt that it would look bad to argue. With a soft jiggling, the termagant raised its head and opened its eyes. Snebrel went to lift its shield and slipped out of his hands, rolling down the steps. The termagant stopped it clumsily with a claw and turned it awkwardly until it could see itself again. Snebrel had seen 1 or 2 items that he had rather liked, and by the look of him, Brocando could leave treasure behind because he had lots more at home, but he felt that it would look bad to argue. With a soft jingling, the termagant raised its head and opened its eyes. Snebrel went to lift his shield, and it slipped out of his hands, rolling down the steps. The termagant stopped it clumsily with a claw and turned it awkwardly until it could see itself again. To Snebrel's amazement, it began to coo at its reflection, and it laid back with a mirror cuddled in its arms. And then the termagant, with a clink, died peacefully in the temple that had been built for a time out of mind. Often, later, it was said by minstrels and wandering storytellers that the termagant died when it caught sight of itself in the mirror. Never believe what you hear in songs. They put in any old thing if they think it sounds better. They said that its reflection glance turned it into a statue. But the death of the termagant was more complicated than that. Most things are. Snebrel and Brocando dragged it up the stairs and buried it under the altar stone. Snebrel remembered Christabella and the other animals back at camp and collected some of the tear puddle into a small jewel case from the heap. The remaining statues were left where they were. In the past, they worshipped the termagants, so the story goes, said Brocando. They are a cruel race. Let them remain for justice. Actually, Snebrel began, as they rode away, I wouldn't mind just a small reward if you happen to have one you're willing to give me anyways. If you don't need, certainly. My tribe needs somewhere to stay for a while, to prepare the wagons and so on. Somewhere where we don't have to look over our shoulders all the time. Easily granted. My city is yours. My people are welcoming you. Are they all small like you? Said Snebrel without thinking. We deaf means are correctly built, said Brocando. It's no business of ours if everyone else is ridiculously overgrown. After a while, as they neared Mudrung's camp, Snibble said, I don't think you've lost a year. If you were a statue, time couldn't have passed for you. In a way, you've gained a year. Everyone else is a year older except for you. Bricando thought about this. Does that mean I still give you the reward? He said. I think so, said Snibble. Right. They arrived at the camp just in time to stop the search party that was setting out. Bricando immediately became the center of attention, something that he had enjoyed and was obviously used to. Snibble was more or less forgotten. More or less. Where have you been? Asked Pismire, relieved and angry. Wandering off like that? Don't you know there are moles about? I'm sorry, said Snibble. Things just happened. Well, never mind now, said Pismire. And what's happening over there? Doesn't any one of your muddle-headed people know how to welcome a king? I don't think so, said Snibble. He's quite brave and a bit excitable and doesn't really listen to much you say. Sounds like a king to me, right enough, said Pismire. Bricando was in the middle of a crowd of chattering, staring Mudrungs, and he was beaming benevolently. There I was, he was saying, one step away from the treasure, then jingle. There it was behind me. So, Pismire elbowed his way through the crowd, removed his hat, and bowed his head till his beard touched the ground, and stuck there, confronting a surprised Bricando with a tangle of white locks. Greetings, O king, said the old man. Honored are we that so great a son of a noble and ancestry would deem us worthy worthy. All we have is at your disposal, vigilant sir. I am Pismire, a humble philosopher. This is, snapping his fingers wildly at Glurk, who was standing open-mouthed at the spectacle of Pismire, still bent double in front of the dwarf warrior. Come on, protocol is very important. Bow down to the king. What's a king? Said Glurk, looking around blankly. Show some respect, said Pismire. What for? Snibble rescued him. He did it. Snibble saw Bane standing at the back of the crowd with his arms folded and a grim expression. He hadn't liked school at Tregan Morris, but he learned some things. The Doomy didn't like kings. They preferred emperors because they were easier to get rid of. And on the way back from the temple, he asked Bricando what he meant when he said his people didn't count. He meant they had nothing to do with Doomy. Hate them, Bricando said bluntly. I'd fight them because they straighten roads and number things and make maps of places that shouldn't be mapped. They turn everything into a count. They'd make the hairs of the carpet grow in rows if they could. And worst of all, they obey orders. They'd rather obey orders than think. That's how their empire works. Oh, they're fair enough. Fair fighters in battle and all that sort of a thing. But they don't know how to laugh. And at the end of it all, it's things in rows and orders and all take the fun out of life. Now Glurk was about to be introduced to the king, at which point Bricando amazed him. He walked up to Glurk and shook him warmly by the hand. When he spoke, it was all in the way he'd used in the temple. It was the kind of voice that keeps slapping you on the back at all times. So you're the chieftain, are you? He said. Amazing. Your brother here told me all about you. It must be an incredibly difficult job. Highly skilled, too. I should wonder. Oh, you pick it up as you go along, Glurk muttered, taken aback. I'm sure you do. Fascinating. And a terrible responsibility. Did you ever have some sort of a special training? Or, no, Dad died and they just gives me the spear and said, "You're chief," said Glurk. "Really? Well, we shall have a serious chinwag about this later on," said Brocandle. "And this is Pismire, isn't it? Oh, do get up. I'm sure philosophers don't have to bow." "What? Jolly good. And this must be General Banus Catrix, I believe." "General," Snibble thought. Bane nodded. "How many years is it, Your Majesty?" he asked. "About 5, I think," said the king. "Better make that 6, in fact." "Above 5, I think," said the king. "Yeah, 6. Yeah." You know each other?" said Snibble. "Oh, yes," said Brocandle. "The Doomy kept sending armies to see us and suggest, most politely, that we submit and be part of their empire. We always told them we didn't want to join. We weren't going to be counted." "I think it was the paying of taxes you objected to," said Bane calmly. "We did not see what we would get out of our money," said Brocandle. You would be defended," said Bane. "Ah, but we've always been quite good at defending ourselves," said Brocandle in a meaningful toned voice. "Against anyone," he smiled. "And then the general here was sent to suggest to us again with a little more force," he said. "I remember," he said, "and that he was afraid that if we'd not joined the empire, there would be hardly any of us to be counted." "And you said you'd be hardly anyone left to do the counting," said Bane. Snibble looked from one to the other. He realized that he was holding his breath. He let it out. "And then what happened?" he asked. Bane shrugged. "I didn't attack," he said. "I didn't see why any good people should die. I went back and told the Emperor that Brocandle's people would make better allies than unwilling subjects. Anyway, only a fool would attack that city." "I always wondered what he replied," said Brocandle. Bane looked down at his ragged clothes. "He shouted quite a lot," he said. There was a thoughtful pause. "They did attack, you know, after you'd been recalled," said Brocandle. "Did they win?" "No. You see, fools," said Bane. "I'm sorry," said Brocandle. You needn't be. It was only one of a number of disagreements I had with the Emperor," said Bane. Snibble took each of them by the shoulder. "Anyway," he said, "just because you're sworn enemies doesn't mean you can't be friends, does it?" When they were having the evening meal, Glurk said to his wife, "He's very gracious. Asked all about me. I've met a king. He's very important. He's called Protocol, I think." "Good name. Sounds royal," she said. And Pismire's a philosopher, he says." "I never knew that. What's a philosopher?" "Someone who thinks, he says," said Glurk. "Well, you think. I've often seen you sitting and thinking." "I don't always think," said Glurk. "Sometimes I just sits." He sighed. "Anyway, it's not just thinking. You've got to be able to talk about it in an entertaining afterward."